Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Mr. Tom Froese. I'm an illustrator and a top teacher on Skillshare, where I've helped over 100,000 students unlock the world of commercial illustration. Welcome to the channel. So today I'm going to take a look at my old Instagram photos. So I downloaded all of the data from Instagram, have it on my hard drive. And the reason I did this is because I want to look at the progression of how I've been sharing my work over the last 10 years. I've been on Instagram for over 10 years. I had an initial account and then got kind of cynical about it and deleted it. That was kind of in the early days. But in 2012, I decided I wanted to go back to it. And so I reinstated my account. This was in 2012. And yeah, so let's just jump right into it. We're looking at Bridge. This is how I can view visual files more visually. And so what we have here in the left-hand column are my posts by month and year. So we have 2012 and then 2013 and so on. So starting in 2012, I had no intentions of using Instagram as an illustration sharing platform. I don't think anyone did. It was such a new thing, and filters were kind of more what Instagram was known for. You could take a picture, add a filter to it, make it look like a vintage camera or a vintage photo. And for some reason, I had it in my mind, I was just going to take pictures of what I called triangle trees, basically evergreen or coniferous trees. And I guess this was kind of coming out of the whole Tumblr era where people would have a dedicated Tumblr, more or less doing the same kind of thing. You pick a thing and you take a picture of it every day or share a picture of it every day and so on. Nothing super exciting here, but what will be interesting is just to see like at what point did I start sharing illustration on my Instagram account? Because now with almost 30,000 followers on Instagram, that's all I post about. So what happened along the way where I decided that's what I was going to do? And so as I go through these, I can talk about the development of my career as seen through my Instagram feed, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at my work or at your work, because it's where we go to share. So it's not just a progression of our work, but it's the progression of how we share with other people. And it's I think becoming increasingly understood that in order to develop ourselves as illustrators, as artists, as designers online, the thing to do is to be sharing as you're growing, as you're developing. Share your work, make something every day and share it. It's just how we work out our creativity in a large part, especially if it's a commercial sort of creativity where we do have to consider our audience and we do have to grow that audience. So again, I started off deciding I was going to just take pictures of trees. When you focus on a subject, you start to notice a wide degree of variation within that subject. So that's what I became interested in. And these are all just shot on my walks or commutes or whatever I was doing, at that time. Even on vacation, I would be thinking about what to look for in terms of triangle trees. This was in Palm Springs. And then back home, up some mountain, snowshoeing or something. And of course, every now and then I depart from the theme, and this was just a tree in general. And I thought it was interesting that there was this little special cover for a baby palm tree in Vancouver. So you can see that as time went on, now we're in 2013, I'm a new dad at this time, so my focus shifts a lot to my daughter and more people. I definitely decided to abandon the tree thing. And I think what happened was more and more people were just using Instagram the way we used to use Facebook, which was to keep up to date with one another. So always kind of having an eye on this sort of urban street photography. I was really into just taking pictures of things that I saw on my commutes, on my walks, on my lunch breaks, and then a little bits of life and the occasional dad joke. Another interesting thing that I was doing around 2013 was I was part of a group of people that met up most Fridays for what we called Lettering Club. And so we'd roll out this vellum paper, kind of like this waxy transparent paper, put it on the table that we were eating at, and just bring out our pens and pencils and do some lettering. And so that was always fun. That was run by Riley Cran, a Vancouver lettering artist and font designer. One thing that I see turn up a lot in my early Instagram was just a lot of interest in lettering and fonts. And then in 2013, we were pregnant again. So there's our oldest, Nina, and then our youngest, Marie, is in the belly there. So you start to see more bits of my process show up, little things I'm working on here and there. So just for context, this is late 2013. This was the year I started freelancing as a designer and an illustrator. So my eye was on moving toward illustration, but of course I was also doing design at the time. So you'll see more and more process of those things showing up in Instagram. So fun fact, if you're familiar with the Dixon pencil brand, there used to be a factory in my hometown of Newmarket, Ontario. And I never did this, but my brother would go to the dumpster at the factory and just grab bagfuls of discarded pencils and interesting stationery that they would have there. So lots of kid photos at this time. I'm really not sure what this Instagram account is about at this time. It's really just whatever I want to post at the time. I remember I was working on, really early into my foray into freelancing. I got some commissions from Offscreen magazine, which is a magazine I had already been a fan of and just loved the design of, and they contacted me to do some illustrations. So this is one of the pieces I did. It looks like a screen grab, but they wanted me to depict this guy at his desk burnt out because he's burning the midnight oil. And that actually got a lot of love on Dribbble and kind of was a big encouragement to me as an early illustrator at that time, seeing that, oh yeah, I could make stuff and, get a little bit of audience engagement on that, especially on Dribbble. That was probably one of my most liked pieces there, possibly to this date. And you can see me kind of trying to work it out here. This was an earlier version that I had going, and it was, the client had just said that it was a little bit too aggressive with his head flat on the screen. So, working out a lot at that time, how do I do what I do? How do I take feedback? What if, I thought this was a great idea to have this idea of him smashing his head into the screen. So it just had that kind of feeling of frustration. But through some feedback, I feel like we just went a more subtle route. And I was happy with how that went. There's me holding a triangle tree, just some bits of process that I was working on at the time. You can see I was still trying to figure out my style. It was very much using these letterpress printy textures, but also just trying to figure out, what am I using this style to represent? Is it just like these flat shapes? Is it more abstract scenes like this? Is it... I'm still kind of all over the place, but in this season, this was again, late 2013, I'm already seeing some real breakthroughs in my career, just in terms of my clients. I had started getting commissions from Monocle magazine, one of my favorite magazines at the time. And so kind of freaking out about like, how do I make illustrations worthy of Monocle magazine? And they were actually a return client, a repeat client for a couple of years in those early days. Another client that I had in those early days was working on some gift cards for the provincial liquor store brand here called BC Liquor Store. And so that was a really fun job to get into. And I think what I'm starting to do here is bring together my love of lettering. So to this day, to this point in my timeline, late 2013, you can see in the feed that I was taking pictures of type and lettering specimens. I was going to meet with people on Fridays for lettering club over drinks. And I was also developing a style that was like representing objects in a flat style and then adding letterpress type texture to it. And so that's kind of just evident in the work that I'm making here. January 2014, of course, my daughter Marie was born, so we might see a lot more family show up in the feed. So at this time, we're still living in Vancouver, but with 2 kids in a very small house at the time, we're starting to feel kind of cramped. And so we're starting to think, where are we going to live next? So we're going to start seeing a little bit more of a life changing. The kind of images that I'm taking, they're going to be less in Vancouver and more in different settings. Except this is 2013, so probably it would be another 2 years actually that we would be in Vancouver before we moved out. So still trying to figure out what am I sharing on this thing called Instagram, and I'm going between process of my own work, things that I like, objects like these vintage matchboxes. And I think what happens is these things never go away, the life, my interest in these ephemeral objects and then my work, but I think it becomes more focused as time goes on. These things are all still there, but they kind of converge through one expression rather than multiple expressions. So let's just breeze through some of these. So this is kind of late 2014. I had an interesting commission from Magma. They make like interesting design ebooks, and they commissioned me to do a book called Stickyscapes New York. And so you'll start seeing lots of my Stickyscapes New York work show up, like this turtle here, horse guy. It was probably to that date the biggest project I'd ever taken on. It was really scary for me because I didn't know how I was going to do it, and I really just made it work the best I could. And I look back and I see all the things that I did wrong, but that book is still in print. It's in multiple languages, and so something worked out for it, and it definitely was a project that led to good things in the future. So even projects that I look back on and think, "Ooh, that was a mess." I learned a lot about what techniques I should and shouldn't use for bigger projects. I kind of decided probably around that time that working in Illustrator was too unwieldy for me. So I finally decided to move from Illustrator to using Photoshop because I liked using textures. And in Illustrator at that time, I had to take all the textures that I made in Photoshop and bring them into Illustrator, and then sending all those things to the client was a headache. So a lot of lessons learned there. I ended up getting some work out of my work for that book, more New York themed stuff in the kind of style that I'd been working on. I was trying to refine it a little bit more. I still kind of felt like it was too rigid for me. Like I was dithering between working in this more rectilinear vectory style, and then also, do I also work in this kind of more brushy style or really physical? Like, who am I as an artist? What is my style? The things we all love to talk about. So this must be 2015. This is when we start, we leave Vancouver, we head out to a little village called Yarrow where we still live. We ended up moving at first to something called an eco village, which is basically a bunch of townhomes on a farm. And it was more communal living. It wasn't for us. We stayed there about 3 or 4 months, I think. Kept getting more and more illustration commissions, continued to sort of dither between a more rigid vector style and something a little bit more physical media-ish or hand-informed. And a thing that I keep seeing show up in my work over and over again is this idea of hand lettering. Using, at this time, ink and brushes and nib pens to do my hand lettering. This is for another thing from Magma. They wanted me to decorate a spaceship shape that they had. So I decided I'd just make a bunch of bumper stickers and put them on, and they loved it. You can see my constant interest in packaging and lettering has just been a through line in this feed. And it's a through line in my illustration. I use a lot of lettering in my illustration. So the question for me is, at what point did I start sharing only illustration on Instagram? What was that shift and why did that happen? Okay, so in 2015, a big thing that happened was I went to a brand new conference in New York City. And so I think that was also around the time when I decided I was going to teach my first Skillshare class. And so I'm thinking about what am I going to teach? And I'm also kind of rubbing shoulders with all these awesome designers in New York City, just feeling a real wave of excitement. And you can start to see me definitely sharing more and more illustration as we go along. And interestingly, around that time, I was at this conference in New York, and around that same time, I had started taking on more projects about New York. Like I did Stickyscapes New York. There was a restaurant that I started doing illustrations for called Quality Eats. And I did the Herb Lester map guide thing. That was this one here. And so I'm starting to feel kind of Like I'm meeting one of the goals that I had when I set out to freelance, which was to get out of my little Vancouver area bubble and do work for more international clients. And so that's definitely starting to happen in 2015, late 2015. And so there's just going to be a lot of new inspiration coming into my feed here. So also the fact that I did my first Skillshare class in Key Illustrations, it really helped me understand who I am as an illustrator. I was kind of, do I do this flat graphic Illustrator vector style, or is it more handmade? And through teaching Inky Illustrations, I started saying, really embracing this identity of my own called an Inky Illustrator, where I had those shapes, those kind of vector made shapes, and I also brought in handmade elements. It was digital and analog. And having taught that, I learned a lot about myself, but also I started seeing the work that people were making as the class project in Inky Illustrations and getting excited about what I saw there as well. Just that potential to teach other people and see what they could do with my techniques. Stickyscapes New York wasn't as bad as I had thought. It actually ended up winning an award at the AOI. And then Magma came back and asked me to illustrate a whole other sticky book called Stickyscapes Space. So you're going to start to see some of that process here. And here was, I think, something that I haven't really thought about until just now. I've often wondered, at what point did I really start illustrating people and becoming comfortable with illustrating people in a certain style? And that question of illustrating people kind of became one of my next classes after Inky Illustrations that I called Odd Bodies. And I think Stickyscapes New York and Stickyscapes Space really forced me to confront my fear of illustrating people in a sort of stylized way. And so I got much more comfortable with doing that. I definitely moved away from any expectation of my illustrated people being somehow elegant or academically drawn or anything like that. Oh goodness, we're only at 2015. Definitely a lot more just pure illustration being shown here with the odd life photo thrown in. Kind of like what I do now, but a little less focused. Lots of diversions here. With Offscreen, I was still illustrating for them 3 years later, but I had asked if I could be a little bit more experimental and expressive rather than so literal in my concepts. And so I was starting to see more illustrations like this. I was very thankful for the ability to experiment. Clearly my style has gone away from this more expressive kind of abstract route, and I think it's for the better. It's just a more versatile way of working the way I do now. 2016 was, I'd say, one of my hardest and most fruitful years. 2016 was, just an interesting year in the world. I think the climate of culture and politics really took a shift. And I think that's besides the point, but I just know that beyond that kind of thing that we all went through in 2016, there's also, for me, I think I was seeing myself grow in certain ways and then seeing the limits of that growth. So for instance, this style that I called Inky that I felt so good about, I was also realizing it really had its limitations. And I mean, I just look at this piece here. It was supposed to be for a magazine. It was about this urban development in Calgary. And I'm really trying to use the same techniques and the same compositional mindset, the way I go about composing my work. The same way I would do that for a simpler piece, maybe with some bottles or whatever, and then some white space. Now I'm trying to make full scene with foreground and background and play with color. And so it all becomes a lot harder for me to figure out how do I do that. And so I remember going through a lot of growing pains, just going through revisions with clients, trying to reconcile how do I illustrate these more complex things. I had some very nice moments as well. I had a lovely client called Stong's, a grocery store in North Vancouver and in Vancouver. And so I got to do this, which to this day remains a bit of an outlier in terms of my work that I share. But I'm very proud of it because it was something that the client was really courageous and they wanted to just take a risk and have fun. And I just wanted to do something that was very bold and expressive and in a way kind of like fast. something that I could do because they had a very short timeline before they needed this artwork up on their store walls. And I think it turned out really well. It won some awards, and the client to this day still rocks it out. Here's just a photo of what when I went to the store opening. My illustrations are still on their wall like that. So it was such a fun project to do. So that whole thing about inky illustrations became such a thing to me that I actually did a presentation at ICON, my first ICON conference in 2016. That was in Austin. And I did it was like a 10 or 15 minute lightning round kind of presentation. And that was a lot of fun and really led to a lot of things. So 2016, again, was just like giving birth. Like, it was painful, and it was also very fruitful. It was painful in terms of figuring out my style, how it worked, figuring out, seeing the limits of my style that I had defined for myself, and trying to push it and really not seeing it being pushed. But on the other hand, getting to use what I developed to that point in so many different ways, meeting important people. I had my first book deal come out of going to ICON that year and presenting. I got a lot of commissions out of just being on stage and people seeing my work from up there. That was a tremendous opportunity. I was also obsessed with this idea of swimming illustrations. And so I was trying to, again, play with my inky illustration and try and develop a style of illustrating people that was more expressive and more abstract in a way, because it was less detailed. And some of it was interesting, but it was something that I kept trying to work this out, and it never got to a place that I really thought it was going to be a thing for me. So you see a lot of people swimming. There was a class I took at ICON with Kyle Webster there. So this class actually was huge for me. So this was the first time I learned actually in a formal way how to use digital brushes. So here I am speaking on inky illustrations using physical media as my way of making these more expressive marks and stuff. And then I'm on a tablet on my MacBook learning from Kyle Webster how to use his digital brushes. And so that really actually opened up a lot of things in my mind, things that I was stuck on in terms of how do you use digital brushes. And so from that point forward, I started actually opening up a lot more to working in a more digital way. And from that point forward, I think my work just progressed to being more and more and more purely digital. So 2017 was another big year, big turning point. I think in 2017, you're going to see a big switch in my Instagram feed to that point where I'm only showing illustration for the most part. And that's because I can't even remember his name, but let me just see if I can find it. In February, I went to this event called Field Trip. It's like a photographer's conference, actually. It takes place in California. This one was in like near San Bernardino in the mountains. And so it had nothing to do with illustration really, but that was what I wanted to. I want to be one kind of creative, kind of a fish out of water. So being an illustrator amongst photographers, what kind of new ways of creativity can I find? And the reason I figured this was a good conference to go to is that I knew some of the people there. I actually met people there too that I still keep in touch with to this day. But so anyway, one of the people speaking, there was different workshops throughout the conference. And so one of the people that I went to go see, he was good at making viral photo mashup type things on Instagram. And I think part of the premise of this workshop was, how to make work that gets more views, more comments, more engagements, how to make work that could go viral. So what I learned from him was this important element of whatever you share on Instagram, it needs to be something someone can name. This is a hat. This is a mermaid holding a beer can. It needs to be something that you can use words to describe rather than it being sort of like, I don't know what I'm looking at. And then another thing that he said was it needs to be interesting. There has to be some kind of visual payoff. So whatever you post, it needs to be something beyond like, just a hat. There has to be something interesting about the way that hat is portrayed. Maybe it's the style, maybe it's what's on the hat, maybe it's who's wearing the hat. And then there was one other aspect there, I think it might have had to do with like, it needed to be done in a surprising way. It needed to be interesting, it needed to be nameable, and it needed to be done in a surprising way. There had to be something more to it. This idea of how to make an interesting post really stuck with me. And then I started posting more and more work that was more specific in that sense. So around 2017, I also was, I had started getting commissions from GQ France, and they became a longtime client of mine. Working for GQ France, I was making these quick illustrations like this based on some of their columns, and it became a real workshop for me in terms of, like, again, developing my style, developing my sense of concept, and how I drew people became more and more defined to me. You can see that I developed a little bit more, my shapes became more defined and more elegant, I think, compared to my Sticky Scapes work. I really started to pay attention to the shape of things and making sure my shapes are really well formed. Okay, so another big thing that came my way in 2017, so I create this class called Inky Maps. It's based on my whole idea of combining analog and digital illustration techniques. And I also loved illustrating maps, so I made a class teaching how to do that. And lo and behold, I started getting commissions to do more maps. So these are just a few snapshots here. So I got this one from GQ France. I'd already been working with them on some of their columns, but this one was like a whole bunch of maps for one of their special issues. And it was to be done in a very short time span. So it was like 6 maps to be done in maybe the span of a week, maybe 2, but it was a lot of work. It was basically a map of every region in the world and all their best kept secret ski hills or something like that. And so doing that really helped me define how I do maps. And my maps are more or less done the same way ever since. And I just learned a lot more about how to work fast and maybe not be so detailed with smaller illustrations, and just allowing myself to be a little bit more footloose and fancy free. I also had to use almost purely digital illustration techniques except for the lettering in those maps. And again, that was a huge thing to grow with at that time. So what I'm seeing here is that there's almost no photos anymore. It's all illustration or photos of my illustration process or the results of my illustrations, but no more family photos. I cut myself off from family photos, and I think that was something I took with me from that photographers conference, ironically enough. And then I taught odd bodies and then got obsessed with just depicting bodies on things. So they started showing up everywhere. And then in 2019, I started working on a book called The Castle the King Built with Nosy Crow. And a couple years later, that came out. Doing more maps, all my work becomes increasingly purely digital. I see that around 2019, my style really started becoming more unified across the board with less variation. And all this just comes from like constantly illustrating, constantly getting new work, constantly working out in the work, looking back at what I did, asking myself, what do I want to keep? What do I want to throw away? How can I bring it all together? What style works across most applications so I don't have to change the style to be able to work on the given content? And a huge part of that was, I think I still wanted to do a handmade something in all my work, and that remained the remnant in there. The handmade remnant was my lettering. I allowed myself to do handmade lettering a lot, but even today, now I do most of my lettering digitally as well. Another huge thing that developed for me at the time was my color palette. So just looking back here, I think around the time that I was working on those maps for GQ, I'm just going back here, I had started to identify colors that I liked working with the most. And in GQ, in those maps, where'd it go? Here, yeah. So I guess late December or late 2017, around November, December, I was starting to develop a color palette of these softer hues that I knew I could use over and over again. And eventually I just kind of formalized it. And the unity of my colors became a huge part of what makes my work more cohesive as well. So I think that you see that in my feed as well. And you can see how using Instagram as a way of sharing and growing can really work. It can really be effective. For me, I'm constantly looking at my body of work as viewed on Instagram. It's not necessarily all my most significant pieces that I share in my portfolio, but it is, my entire body of work in a more whole way. If you think about it, like our portfolio is just like our best hits, but the stuff that we're doing every single day, that story of our development really is happening where we're sharing most of our work with our audience. And on Instagram, I'm using that constantly as a way of seeing how are things coming together in my style, how are things coming together in what I'm doing, and really getting a sense of how to hone that and tweak that moving forward. So I think whatever I started doing in 2019 with my people and my colors and my overall stylistic approach has pretty much been my approach ever since. And so I'm still in that era. I think if anything, my characters are getting even less intricate. I'm getting much more whimsical and silly with how I depict people. And interestingly enough, a lot of my work has always been with these well-defined shapes of bodies made with the pen tool in Photoshop. And especially for smaller, more minor people, I'm getting much more comfortable just drawing them directly using digital brushes, just more or less drawing them in instead of designing them in, if that makes sense. And so this is something that I see as a trend moving forward is being more liberal with how I draw people and less strict and worried about how like crisp those shapes are. I like a little bit of that crispness that's happening here. Everything here is very straight, pen tool-y, but then in the back here, I'm just drawing in with like a rough brush and just letting it be. And I kind of like that too. You can see with this guy, I didn't use any pen tool. This is just all digital brush. And I did that also with some recent maps that I did last summer. Some pen tool going on here, but also some people I just drew in with brush like this guy here. So what I might end up seeing, what you might end up seeing in my work is more of these foreground people even being drawn with less of a harsh, strict vector shape. It's not a whole lot different. It's just a little bit more organic looking. Pardon the quality here. These are Instagram resolution illustrations, so zooming in on them on my computer screen here is not going to be very sharp. I think this year I've kind of allowed myself to not worry so much about my Instagram feed and consistency because it's almost automatic based on what I'm working on. And I am showing a bit more behind the scenes or photos as well. Also doing far fewer posts than I used to. If you go back to like previous years, I post every day, sometimes multiple times a day. Now I post a few times a month. And it's just actually, honestly, it's a reflection of the fact that I'm doing less illustration these days. I'm doing bigger jobs that are slower and they're kind of higher budget projects, but I'm not doing as many smaller jobs. Another thing that's happening is that a lot of my time is now being used for writing, for doing these videos, for writing my next classes and stuff like that. And so it's harder to get a lot of work up on my Instagram feed when I'm not making it as much. And so things are picking up right now on the illustration side. So hopefully I will be getting up more work on the gram. But in the meantime, it's interesting just to look back and see how Instagram has been a part of my growth, not just a place for sharing it, but a place for like a tool for gauging how my artistic development is coming along. What's the story of how my style is developing? And I've always looked at my feed and thought, what is working? What isn't? Why does it all feel so scattered and separate and non-cohesive? And now when I look at my feed, increasingly, it always just feels a lot more cohesive. That's very important to me because I want to have a consistent voice, a consistent style, something that's predictable for me and able in terms of as a tool to work with and for my clients so they know what to expect when they hire me. I think the overall observation over time is on my Instagram feed, I went from not knowing what my thing was, like, what am I doing here? What's the point? And I think the point back then was just like general sharing with my friends and having a laugh or showing something I thought was cool. And as I began developing my craft and becoming more specific about what Instagram was for me, it became more of a platform for sharing illustration, not just that I'm excited about, but kind of with the voice of a teacher, of illustration. And today my audience really is, in my mind, and I actually believe literally on Instagram, is my students or people who look to me for some kind of insights in the practice and profession of illustration. And so what a journey. That's 10 years. I guess in December, it will be 10 years on Instagram as an illustrator. And it will be very interesting in 10 years' time from now to see what happens with how I'm sharing with my work and what happens to how illustrators are sharing their work right now. So maybe well, first of all, thank you very much for watching to the end. I know this was a very long video. Yeah, I think I just was hoping to share something this week. This came to mind as something I could do. So here it is. But I'll ask you the question, and this is something I'm thinking about now, is like, will Instagram be around in a few years' time? And if not, how are illustrators going to be sharing? What will sharing illustration look like in, let's say, 5 years' time? Where will people be sharing their work the most? And what will that look like? Anyway, my name is Mr. Tom Froese. You can find all my classes at tomfroese.com/teaching. And if you use the links there, you'll get 30 days free on Skillshare if you're not already a student on the platform. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.